All right, guys, so this is going to be our notes for the graphing section in your Chapter 1 packet. And if you go ahead and turn to page 12, you are going to go ahead and fill out the notes as we move through it. Write down any additional notes that you might need in that blank area on that page. We'll go through some examples, and then you're going to go ahead and do some work on your own. So first off, two types of graphs that we typically use in science are either going to be line graphs and bar graphs. When we deal with working with a line graph, that's going to be showing a direct relationship between your two variables. So we're going to look at how does one variable affect the other variable. If one variable increases, does the other increase? If one variable increases, does the other decrease? How are they related to each other, and how do they go ahead and affect each other's outcomes? So that would be a line graph. And a bar graph is going to go ahead and show a comparison of groups with no direct relationship. So we're going to go ahead and look at different groupings, but we're not looking at how they are related to each other and how they affect each other. So in this case here, for a bar graph, we're looking at different sports, and we're looking at which students like those sports. So no one bar is related to each other or causing an effect on the other one. We're just going ahead and simply looking at how are the different tallies within each sport within that class. Okay, so line graph showing a direct relationship, bar graph just simply showing a comparison. Now, when we look at creating a graph, there are different parts of a graph that absolutely have to be there so that if somebody is looking and trying to analyze that data or look for a relationship, they can properly see it. So the first thing, and one of the most important things, is that the graph has a title. Okay, this title should be informative. And a really good option to go ahead and make sure that it is informative is to go ahead and make sure that you include the independent and the dependent variable in the title. So if you have both of those things in the title, it typically is going to be informative enough and should allow the reader to see what is the data that they're looking at regarding. Next item is looking at the axes. So when we look at a graph, we have the x-axis, which is the horizontal axis going left to right. That axis is always going to be for the independent variable, and it should be titled on that axis. Then we have the y-axis. That's going to be our vertical axis going up and down. And that axis is always going to be for our dependent variable, and that also should be titled. Now, whenever we are leaving these titles for our variables on the x and the y axis, if there is any unit of measurement being used, we also want to make sure that we include that. So if we are measuring something in inches or thousands or centimeters, we want to go ahead and make sure that we also add that in our axis title. That gives us an idea as to what these measurements are. Okay, a simple thing to think about is, would you want to go ahead and have $1 or $100 or $1,000? So that unit makes a difference as to what we are getting. And therefore, when we're looking at a graph and we're interpreting data, we want to make sure that we are understanding that data correctly, and the units are going to allow us to see that. So those are things you definitely want to remember when you are putting your graph together. Now, another very important item to talk about with graphing is what we call scaling and the intervals that we space things out on the x and the y axis. So when we go ahead and we scale out our x and our y axis, we want to make sure that we are using consistent intervals. So if we are looking at the y axis here, okay, we are going up by 20s. So at the origin, we are at 0, and then we go up by 20, and then we go up by the next 20, and the next 20, and the next. So we are consistently going up by 20 all the way up the axis. You cannot just randomly start changing what your interval is. Okay, so you want to keep it consistent. Also, you'll notice that we are spacing it out consistently. So about every 4 boxes is the space between our next number. That is a consistent spacing we want to keep, so that way when somebody is interpreting that data, it's easier for them to interpret it. And also we want to make sure we're using the entire graphing area and spacing things out well. Okay, same thing on the x-axis, you'll notice, okay, this scaling, we are going up by 0.01 every few boxes. Okay, it does not need to be the same interval as what you did on the y-axis. And notice we are also spacing it out across the entire x-axis. So that when we plot that data is very easy to read. We can interpret that data, and we can go ahead and actually read points in between the data points that are plotted and make any conclusions that we need to. If we go ahead and we look at the graph to the right, okay, although our spacing and our increments and our intervals are done consistently, however, if you notice, the graph is very, very scrunched together, and it's very hard to go ahead and read our different points because it is so tiny. If we go ahead and we space out that graph properly, as we are in the left one, it makes it much easier to go ahead and read and interpret that graphing. So go ahead and try to space out and use that entire area when you are graphing in class. All right, when we go ahead and we create line graphs, some things that we are looking for that you have on your graph. So use it as a checklist. You'll notice in your notes packet, it actually goes through all of these points for you to remember to have them. So first and foremost, always have that informative title. Then you're going to want to go ahead and label your x-axis with your independent variable and include any proper units if needed. Then you're going to go ahead and label your y-axis with your dependent variable and also, again, any units that need to go along with it. Then you're going to want to space out and scale both of your axes. So again, look at your intervals, look at being able to space things out to use the entire graphing area so that your graph is easy to read. Make sure your intervals are consistent. Again, what you use as an interval on the y-axis does not need to be the exact same interval you use on the x-axis. It's just that whatever you start with on the y-axis, you want to consistently use all the way up the y-axis. And same for the x. When you go ahead and create a line graph, you are going to be given data points and you need to properly plot them on the graph. And we will go over that in the example in just a second. And then last but not least, something that we commonly forget, we are dealing with a line graph. So we actually need to see a line. So once you have plotted those points, you need to actually connect the dots and form a line so we can see what trend and what relationship is occurring in that data. All right, so let's go ahead and look at an example. So we have a data table here. We're looking at different years, and we are looking at population in millions. So first and foremost, we want to go ahead and make sure we include a title. So we're going to go ahead and give ourselves a title, population. And we can even put that unit here that we're looking at millions over the years. Okay, that way we know we're looking at population, the unit we're using is millions, and we're looking over the course of some years. Now, when we look at that data table, we need to look at what is our independent and our dependent variable. So again, always think about what is the one that we're going to be measuring and collecting that data on. That's going to be our dependent. And what is the one that we as a scientist are choosing to look at? And that's going to be our independent. So in this case, we as a scientist can go ahead and choose what years we are going to pull that data from. So that's going to be our independent, and that is going to go on the x-axis. And then the thing that we can collect our data on and record is going to be the actual population. So that's going to be our dependent, and that is going to go on our y-axis. And again, because we are using a certain unit, we want to go ahead and pull that in on our label as well. Okay. Otherwise, when we look at these numbers, we're going to think that we just have 63 people or 76 people. Okay, that's very different from either 76,000 or 76 million. So again, we want to make sure that we have that unit attached to our title as well. All right, now we need to go ahead and scale out and space out our years. So we have 1881, 1890, 1900, 1910, 1920, and 1930. So we can obviously space it out probably about every 2 or 3. And we can go ahead and easily go up by tens. So if we start with 1880, we know that just past that would be 1881. Okay, so we can go ahead and put in 1880. Then we can go ahead and skip a few. Okay, and I always like to go ahead and mark out first where I'm going to put my labels for the years and make sure it all fits. So this would be 1890. Then we have 1900, 1910, 1920, and 1930. And I still have a little bit of space at the end, but at least it's still nicely spaced out. And you could maybe even go every 4 boxes and fit that in. Once I see that my tick marks fit in properly, I can go ahead and actually write in the rest of my years. Okay, and now I need to go ahead and do the same for my y-axis. I want to go ahead and scale that out. So my lowest number is 50.2, and then my highest number is all the way up to about 123. So I need to go ahead and look at what do I want my interval to be. Okay, what do I want to start at? And I can look at my spacing. So if I decided to go up by 20s, okay, I can go ahead and kind of plot it out and see if that works. So if I have 20, 40, 60, 80, 100, 120, 140. Okay, that will go ahead and allow me to space it out really well and easily be able to read that graph. So if I start at 20 million, then 40, 60, 80, 100, 120, and 140. Okay, keeping that consistent, going up by 20s on that y-axis. Now I need to go ahead and actually plot my points. So when you are given a line graph, you're going to be given 2 points, and that gives you your coordinates. So 1881 is going to be my x coordinate. 50.2 is going to be my y coordinate. And they're going to come together and form a point. So the first thing I need to do is go across the x-axis, find 1881, right past 1880. And then I need to follow it up to where 50.2 would be. So if this is 40, okay, this midline is going to be 50. So I'm going to make that point just slightly above, okay, that spot. Next, I have 1890. That's going to go up to about 63. So I follow it up. Okay, here's 60. This would be 70. So I need to go ahead and make it just below the midpoint. Oops. Let's go ahead and fix that one. Okay, so I've got my 2 points. 1900 is 76, so I go to 1900. Follow it up. Here's 70. Here's 80, so it's going to be just above that midpoint for 76. Okay, 1910, and I have 92 million, so I'm going to go all the way up. Here's 80. Here's 90, and it's going to be just above that 90 mark. Okay, 1920 is 105.7. Okay, so we can obviously just kind of figure 106. So 1920 all the way up to where 100 is. Here's 110. We're going to go just below that. Okay, and last but not least, 1930, 122.8. So up to where 120 is, and then just above that. Now that we have our points plotted, again, we need to go ahead and connect those dots and actually make a line graph. So we're going to go from point 1 to point 2 to the next and follow and connect our dots. We absolutely do not want to connect down to the origin. That is data that we don't have, so we cannot assume. So we cannot connect there. We start with the very first dot and we connect all the way to the last dot. Okay, and then that is our line graph. All right, now when we interpret line graphs, so obviously we can go ahead and easily find where those actual points are plotted. So at 8 a.m. we can look and follow it over and figure what the temperature was here. Okay. The other nice thing about line graphs is we can see a trend. So we see that At the start of the day, it was a little bit cooler. Then as the day went on, the weather got warmer. And then as it got towards the late afternoon, it started to cool down a little bit. We can also go ahead and interpret in between actual plotted points what the actual data says. So if we want to go ahead and we see 9 o'clock, it was 70 degrees, 10 o'clock, it was 80 degrees. Well, we might say, well, what was it at about 9:30? So instead, we can go between that midpoint, draw it up, and where we hit that line, we can bring it over to the y-axis and go ahead and make that interpretation that, well, it was probably about 76 degrees at 9:30 in the morning. Okay, so you can go ahead and interpret using that line graph data points that aren't actually plotted. You can go ahead and try to figure out that data kind of in between those points. All right, now bar graphs, those are usually pretty simple, and we're going to include all of the same things that we do in the line graphs, except this time instead of plotting points, we're going to be simply just drawing the bars. So we're still going to have an informative title. X and Y axis are still going to be labeled. X is the independent variable, Y is the dependent variable. Make sure we include our units if needed. Make sure things are spaced and scaled out correctly so that we're using the entire graphing area and we're not scrunching it all into one corner. Make sure any intervals you are using are consistent. So if we look over here, okay, on the y-axis, we're doing number of students. So we are going up by 2s, and notice that we continue to go up by 2s the entire way. We don't just randomly start changing what we go up by midway. Make sure your bars are drawn neatly in and they're all the same width. Okay, so you'll notice these bars are all nice and neat. We don't want to go ahead and have one bar be like super thick and then the next bar be super skinny and the next bar be medium. We want to go ahead and make them consistent and nice and neat and organized. Okay. All right, so for bar graphs, that is what you're going to want to include. Now what you guys are going to go ahead and do is you will see on Google Classroom there is a posting that actually has pages 13, 14, and 15 from your notes packet. And you're going to go ahead and make those graphs using Kami. So you can actually draw on your Chromebooks and create those graphs. And we can go ahead and check them and make sure you guys are on the right track. So you're going to go ahead and work on that assignment. And as always, ask questions if you have them.